holder of the MacArthur Fellowship, which is commonly known as a Genius Grant. Her publications include co-authored volumes of Deaf in America, she is an author of Inside Deaf Culture, two textbooks on American Sign Language, and numerous scholarly articles in journals such as PNAS, Journal of Linguistics, and the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. It's my pleasure to welcome today Dr. Carol Padden, and her topic for this afternoon's discussion is Origins of Sign Languages. Dr. Padden. I had a few thoughts before I started that I'd talk about. So last night I was on the plane on my way to the East Coast, and I thought, when is it that the last time I was here that I gave a presentation? I think it was over in the Student Activity Centre building, or the Student Academic Centre, excuse me. And I gave that presentation, and at the end of it invited participants to ask questions. Ronice Mueller de Quadros asked me a question at the very end, and her question was actually the last question that was asked. She's a coder. She grew up knowing sign language as her first language. She's from another country. She then came to Gallaudet, and she said, I see many signers who are able to learn a second sign language very quickly, are quite adept within 2 to 3 months, a very short span of time. Why is that? Why is it that we can get a basic understanding of a secondary sign language fairly quickly? And my answer at the time was because it's the visual system, because of the iconicity. But however, and Ronsi's not here, which is unfortunate, I can't answer her directly, I now have perhaps a different answer to that question. So we started working with American Sign Language. We were in Bill Stokey's lab. Then I was at Georgetown University as a sophomore, doing work with Bill Stokey and getting quite excited about the generation of work coming out in sign language. So we looked at all of the elements that we knew about sign languages, and some of those have persisted, some of those assumptions, but some of them I now have a different view on, based on where I was at that time. Let me think how old I might have been, possibly 19 or 20. So at the end, I'll talk about what I've been doing in the years since those original beginnings of looking at sign language. And hopefully you'll be able to catch some of the differences that I relate to as we go through. So this project started a little over 12 years ago. I was working in Israel. You can see this picture in the lower right-hand side. We were in Haifa at that university, working on a new sign language. And at that time, we didn't think to call it a young sign language or to compare it with an older sign language. We just categorized everything we saw as sign language. But since then, I've started realizing that there are different kinds of sign languages. There are the newer ones that have emerged in the last perhaps 20, 30 years, and the older, more established ones that are maybe 200 plus years old. So here in the US or in Europe is one set of work, but my interest has forced me to go to other places to look at these newly emerging languages, and bringing with me the tools of those established languages, and yet realizing that they're not all necessarily applicable to that new study. That sent me back to the lab. looking at what we can do with the new languages and the tools that we've used for established languages. So I'm going to work you through some of the places that we're now undertaking study. 2 years ago, I started working on an additional new language in southern Turkey, Central Taurus Sign Language. There's a mountain range in southern Turkey called the Taurus Mountains. And there are deaf people scattered about in different communities around that mountain. The difference between that and, I'll say, Bedouin Sign Language that we were researching in Haifa is that there are 125 or so deaf people in the Bedouin community in the same village. With Central Taurus Sign Language, there are about 500 users, but they're in different communities, so they're spread throughout villages over the mountain. So in each village of perhaps 500 or so people in the Central Taurus Mountains, there'll be perhaps 12 sign language users in each of those communities. So, this slide shows some of the people who have been assisting in this enterprise, and a couple of the names that you may see are actually Gallaudet students, so they've been participants, and I thank them very much for their contributions. And then this is the group that I've been working with in Israel and in Turkey. I have a communications director up there telling me how to work my videos. So we think of American Sign Language, Japanese Sign Language, and that general group that we classify as sign languages. We also know that there's some overlap in gesture, and all of these elements appear in particular situations, in particular conditions. So starting with home sign, for example, where there is one deaf person surrounded by hearing people, home sign may be generated. It's an area that's been studied. Then family sign language, where there may be 2 or 3 siblings who are deaf within the same family construct around a larger family that are hearing. Then there is natural sign. Elizabeth Mara Green from Boston has undertaken study in that area, looking at the sign languages of deaf people living in the capital of Nepal. So those who are in Kathmandu. Deaf people live in the city, and every now and then you'll encounter one, but they have not attended schools. They'll meet one another within the city confines. So it's a community of deaf people, and yet they're not correction. It's not necessarily a community of deaf people per se, but deaf people living in that wider environment who encounter one another. So then there's another category of village sign languages where they are not necessarily holding the structure of what one might find if they went to a residential school, but are encountering one another in the native environment. There's some gestural engagement, but that sign language that's used doesn't have any connection to deaf schools, deaf clubs, and the like. Then there's the new urban sign languages. So in Nicaragua, there are apparently around 10,000 signers. Then in Israel, the Israeli Sign Language was established somewhere in the 1940s, 47, 48, with the origin of the deaf schools, and then with other people emigrating from places in Europe into central Israel and continuing the formation of that language. Then there are established languages like Japanese Sign Language, languages that are handed down through generations and also concreted in the school systems, leading in the end to international sign language, and looking at the kinds of situations where each of these elements appear. If it's within the individual, within a nuclear family, deaf people who randomly meet one another, deaf people who live in the same community or village, different social and cultural structures around how these elements of sign language and these sign language forms develop. So I'm actually not going to talk about all of these in today's presentation. I'm going to select a few. So we believe that there is a common generation of gesture base in most of these sign languages. They have what is called an iconic system. Adam Kendon studied gesture for quite some time and has found that in hearing people who are not related to the deaf community, in Australia, where a woman's husband dies, the woman in that community will stop talking and they will instead use a form of sign language. But when that language was under further scrutiny, it seems that it's more a sign exact English, in a sense, more a visual form of English. It's not something that's passed down to the children. It's not something that the other adults use. It's only something that the female widows use in that particular environment. So when you're looking at the signs for morphemes in particular languages, talking about the iconic system and what they mean, how they're generated and how they grow, comes from somewhere. Potentially that comes from gesture, and the sign exact English system doesn't really relate to this part of it. So as I said earlier, Ronsi had asked me a question that said, how is it that a secondary sign language seems easy to learn? So I took that question to look at the idea of a new sign language, so a language that's 50 or perhaps even only 20 years old. How do those users understand one another so well? So maybe within a 20-year language, the structure's not fully developed yet, and nonetheless, those communicants can understand one another. They can navigate their way through that communication. And then if there are perhaps 50 years invested in this language, as in ABSL, those 2, potentially 3 generations of people are able to understand one another well. We gave video tests and looked at people's responses to that, and they respond very well. They know how to represent the pictures, they know how to respond to the tests, they can talk about time, and they have structure and syntax within what they're doing. And yet that's a very short time for that generation of language. So that's what we have started to look at more closely. And that forced us to ask ourselves some questions, a couple of hard questions about what language is. So let me go further and talk you through what it is I mean by that. These are third generation signers. They tend to be very smooth, very fluent communicators. They're not struggling to understand a word or to decide how to convey a concept. And yet this language that they're using is only 60, maybe 70 years old, but there's an obvious structure within there and an obvious ability to use that to communicate with one another. I mean, in a sense, it looks a bit like American Sign Language. It's not, it's a different sign language, but it really could be any established language. And these are Bedouin Sign Language users. So I'd like to move from what's the broad category of human communication movement and move to the human category of communication, the communication movement, and talk about some categories within that. So there's co-speech and gesture, the kind of thing I'm doing right now, where the gesture becomes dependent on what is being spoken. It's called co-speech gesture. And when a hearing person is forced to not rely on their spoken language at all and simply to gesture, it's something we call silent gesture. It can also be related to the idea of pantomime or going to a foreign country if you don't communicate in that language and trying to figure out how much something costs, etc. Hearing people typically stop speaking and resort to gesturing in some way, shape or form to try and be understood. It's a little different than the theatrical type of pantomime, the Marcel Marceau type. That's a particular art form, and it's not what I'm referring to here. I'm more referring to the spontaneously generated gesture that people use to communicate across a language. There's also what we can call cosine gesture. People don't often notice it because of the reliance on signs, but there is some research that suggests that gesture indeed finds its way into signing, even within that language communication strategy. Now, I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about that particular piece, and nonetheless, it's an interesting idea, though, that non-signer's gesture and signer's gesture also. And then the fourth category in this human communicative movement is sign language itself, the use of body for the purposes of communication. There are different types and how they're interwoven into a sign language. So this is actually a VL2 project, so the collaborators in that are recognised down the bottom. We certainly thank them for their support in looking at children and their ability to solve math problems, and gesture being engaged in that learning process to see how that affects children's understanding of math. Now let's move more specifically to the use of the body itself. When I started my work with Bill Stokoe, he was developing a written system for a dictionary of sign language. And we realized, many of us at that time, that we tended to look at the hand and what the hand was doing, almost as though it was a disembodied entity. We recognized that the body was part of it, and it was there to support what the hand was doing, because in a sense you have to have that body connected. But we didn't really think about the body itself as part of the meaning of the signs we were looking at. We looked at, instead, the hands and what they were conveying without necessarily making that connection. But the hands, nonetheless, are embodied in that communication. I mean, if you took the hands, if you literally cut the hands off a person, sign language linguists would have a whole different purpose in how they're looking at the analysis of sign language and their ability to understand what's being said and how it's being conveyed. We use the hands to talk about signs, we use the hands to show the signs, to document, etc., and yet we have, to date, somewhat overlooked the importance of the body in how those signs are connected for the overall communicative intent. So the body is certainly part of the meaning. And I have several examples to show you what I mean as we go along. But it functions as articulator, I'm going to talk you through now 3 experiments that we have undertaken to look at what's going on in our examinations of sign language. So as we watched the Bedouin signers, there was a couple of things that actually I was not the first person to notice. One of my colleagues did. My colleague said, in 30 years of studying sign language, these are a couple of things I had not looked at. So I'm going to talk you through them. We decided to design a couple of experiments, and Adam Stone was involved in some of the early parts of this. We were looking at how we were going to approach this study, and honestly it came out of a bit of a fog. It got clearer as we went on. But what we decided to do, as I said, was develop an experiment to look at some of the differences in Bedouin Sign Language. So we looked at hearing people who do not know sign language, recruited them in terms of the silent gestures part. So by and large, that was college students from UCSD, and we asked them if they'd ever taken a sign language course before. If they hadn't, they were then eligible to participate. And we showed them pictures of tools. Now, not things like cars, trucks, buildings, etc., but of tools, things that you can physically pick up and hold to use. So like this: toothbrushes, scissors, saws. We had 27 different tools in all. And we simply said, what is this? And that was the naming element. So we asked hearing people who don't know sign language what these are, what these pictures represented, and to show us in some way other than spoken language. And they tended to sort of giggle a bit and try to figure out a way to do it, but they thought it was good fun. So that was the first group. And then we asked a group of these new signers using the new sign language, and then we used American Sign Language users and New Zealand Sign Language users, the established languages. The hearing non-signing American students, interestingly, we compared with hearing Bedouin non-signers as well over in Israel to see if there were any similarities. And then the deaf Bedouin users were the group of users of the new sign languages, and each group took about 10 minutes or so to get through looking at their pictures. So these are some of the hearing students from UCSD looking at the idea of a paintbrush. This is the picture at the bottom that they were shown. And all of them, in each group, all of them saw the same pictures. The hearing students all used the same strategy. So all of them did that vertical up and down motion, some of them aiming for a wall in their vicinity, some of them just in general space, but all of them used the idea of holding the paintbrush. So then we looked at different ways of coding, looking at the hands with their body, and how we could record that. So when you think about it, the idea of showing a paintbrush looks like the idea of actually painting. That's called imagistic iconicity. It looks like what you're actually doing. So the verb reflects the noun. But then we decided we wanted to look at patterned iconicity, which is how you represent that action. So we call that holding. So the idea of handling the brush, how might you do that? And painting obviously doesn't just happen on a vertical wall, but in whatever form it happens, we can call it handling when you show how you hold and use that tool. So these are some of the respondents from New Zealand looking at handling. There are other sign languages around the world that will also use that strategy of handling. And then the next group looks a little similar, but is actually different. The new sign language users, when videoed, we looked at their results, and they're actually quite different to what we expected. And she's actually talking to her hearing sister who's off camera. They're all from different families. There are 4 or 5 different families represented here, and yet all of these respondents use the same hand shape and the same motion. So it would be handling with a closed fist, but with the index finger included in that sign, it becomes instrument. So using an index finger to show brushing teeth, would that be handling or instrument, the way I've just shown it? It would be instrument. What about a saw, using a handsaw? can be handling, can be instrument. So they're just ways to think about what's being reflected. Now this is the group from Central Taurus that we looked at, and so we thought it'd be interesting to see what their responses were. And they're from Turkey, so we didn't have any expectation that they'd have ever met any of the people from Israel. Handling. All of them did some variation of what it might look like to actually comb one's hair, with differences, but some similar strategies. So which one did they select? They were using instrument. So they're all using the same strategy, and yet with different signs to show it. We saw a similar result with the Bedouin signers. Different hand shapes that they used, but the same strategy. And so that's the difference between imagistic, what something looks like, versus patterned iconicity, where you can see that what that strategy is. So now that I've taught you handling and instruments, let's talk about the other pattern, object. This is where you show what an object looks like, an object that is not moving, that has no action attached to it. These are hearing undergrads first. Let's take a look at their responses. This is the hand shape he used. He didn't show where his pants might be, but instead he showed this hand shape. And we thought they would all come into the same category, but we realized that they didn't. So when you look at this hand shape, it could be all number of things. So what we call size and shape specifier classifiers, we can also call objects. So, but that means we don't yet know what the object is without knowing what the action is that it might accomplish. So at this stage it's just an object. So this sign, for example, is this instrument or object? It's an object. What about this one? It could be handling as well as object, right? If I attach an action to it. So there are some forms that aren't clearly defined yet. So those are the ones we decided not to use in our experiments. So for example, this sign could be me pushing against a wall, or it could be the wall itself. So it could be object or handling. Likewise, this hand shape could be handling or object. But others are more clearly defined, or handling or instrument rather, and you usually know which it is. So is anyone, hopefully nobody's confused by the differences between the three categories at this stage, because we'll go on to the fourth method. So gesture uses this as well as sign language, and as we've just discussed, object, handling, instrument, and now we go to tracing, which is using a hand shape to convey the shape of something. So there are two strategies here. Tracing and, can anyone see the second strategy? Handling. Correct. He used both, showing the shape of the comb and then the comb. So some people employ more than one strategy in their response. So hopefully you get a sense of what I've been doing with all of this. So if you think about something like using a hammer, it involves the body. Looking at a round object doesn't yet, until we know it's a ball. Likewise, a hand shape, a D hand shape in space, we don't know what it is yet until we make it into a toothbrush or a mascara. So it can be a size and shape specifier first until you add an object or a usage for it, and then it becomes embodied within that action. Let's head to the next. So if I do this, or this, or this,
They all have different hand shapes, but they're all examples of the same strategy. This presents a different way of analyzing sign language, and you'll see in a moment why I chose to analyze it this way. What you're seeing here are people using different hand shapes. Okay, so this is one village with 3,000 people, 100 of whom are deaf, and they have a variety of ways to refer to a comb. In ASL, would you say that everyone pretty much has the same standard sign for comb? You fingerspell comb. Okay, anyone in the audience? Okay, you use a handling strategy. Does anyone use this hand shape? No? So what's odd about that is that there are more signers here. There should be more variation, but that's actually not the case. When you have a larger population of signers, your signing becomes more standardized, and when there are less people, you end up having wider variety. So in a smaller village, you know exactly who these people are. You might know 4 different signs for comb. When you have a bigger community, you run across many strangers, and it becomes more important to have standardized signs. So intuition might say that it should be the reverse, but actually signs become more standardized the larger a community is. Now I'd like to compare. This is the same experiment, but I'll show you the results for hearing American non-signers, hearing Bedouin non-signers, deaf people who use ABSL, deaf people who use American Sign Language, and deaf people who use New Zealand Sign Language. We showed the same image to all 5 groups, and these are the results of their responses. Overwhelmingly, hearing non-signers use the handling strategy for talking about these images of tools, as did the hearing Bedouin non-signers. They showed a strong preference for handling. We saw the exact opposite pattern for those who used ABSL. There was an overwhelming preference for using instrument signs. We saw a similar trend with ASL users. There were some signs, for example, hammer. The noun reference to it is a handling sign. The same for same for lipstick. There are other signs like toothbrush where you have variations where you could use instrument or handling. Just like with comb, you could use the instrument or handling version. So that trend wasn't as strong in ASL just due to the nature of what our nouns look like. In New Zealand Sign Language, they showed the opposite pattern. They had a preference for handling. So they didn't show the same pattern as ABSL and ASL signers. We then looked at what older ABSL signers used, and their preference looked much more like hearing gestures. And I think that that was part of just my own influence because I didn't see it as someone who uses American Sign Language, but those who use Israeli Sign Language caught on to it right away. When you look just at the instrument patterns and you start to look at the results of those who use sign language, you see that there is a trend that more instrument strategies are used in sign language than in gesture. So language sort of ramps up the instrument form. What's important here is that we see an increase in the instrument form in sign language, but that does not mean that handling forms are not used. They're not replaced. They're simply an alternation. There's an option. So if there's a sign language that's only 30, 40 years old, what we already see is a preference for instrument signs. What might be the reason for that increase? Why would you not see a continuation of the pattern that we saw in hearing gestures? We decided then that we needed to take another look at this. We wanted to try something different, so we ran another experiment. We wanted to see what would happen if we showed participants films of actions with these tools in use. So a person combing their hair. Okay? Make sense? Now, again, we'll go back to looking at the results of gesturers and signers. We would ask them to refer to the tool that they see in the picture and then tell us what they saw in the video. And then we reverse the order of presentation for some of the subjects so that we would make sure that we could see if there was a difference between whether they saw the video first or the picture first. We wanted to see if there would be any differences in what they did if they saw the picture versus the video. We hypothesized that people would be more likely to use the handling verb when they saw the tool being used, when they saw it in action. These were the results when we showed ASL users pictures of tools. You still saw a preference for using the instrument strategy, but what happens if you show them a video? When we showed the pictures to ASL signers, many would just name the object, the lipstick, the mascara, the hammer, the scissors, what have you. They would name them. But when we showed them with a video with the tool in action, they would give a phrase like, a woman is combing her hair. So we needed to be able to parse out the nouns in the sentence and the verbs in the sentence. These are the results for what they did when they watched videos. If it was a verb in the sentence, it was more likely to be a handling strategy versus if it was a noun. But if they referred to the thing as a noun, it was more likely to be an instrument strategy. So to reiterate for the sake of the way that the video is presented, if they referred to the object as a noun in their sentence, they were more likely to use the instrument strategy. If they used it as a verb, then they used it as a handling strategy. So now this gave us further insight into why people use one of the two strategies. If they wanted to give more emphasis on how something was used, then they would use it as a handling strategy. In the newer sign language, they don't have noun-verb pairs. They don't have that sort of contrast. But we, in ASL, because it's an older, more established sign language, can use these as strategies to show contrast between actions and objects. Yet, there was something interesting. That alternation between handling and instruments was only seen when talking about an action. If you're talking about the actual object, like the product, you don't alternate. So, for example, you can buy paint at the store, and you only see people use that with the instrument form, not the handling form. You can talk about painting. You can say that you painted and use either the handling or instrument form. But if you're talking about the material, then you have to have a frozen form. So if you're talking about wood, then you would have to use the instrument form, not... So that alternation has something to do with using the tool. All right? I'm going to continue with the talk now to show you the next experiment, which I think is one of the most interesting parts of what we did. The results I just showed you were from those who use ASL, but what do hearing non-signers do? Do they demonstrate a preference for using handling or instrument strategies depending on whether they see an image or a video? If a hearing non-signer watched a video, They were significantly more likely to use a handling strategy than instrument. I'm sorry, I should restate that. They used handling when they saw the video slightly more than the percent of time that they used handling for when they looked at a static image. Hearing non-signers in response to seeing images, so static images, were slightly more likely to use the instrument strategy for pictures than videos. Do you understand what I'm doing here in this analysis? This indicates that hearing people already have something intuitive, that there is something different about how to represent actions versus things. They're not aware of it, but you see these trends in their responses. And what do we make of this? It must mean that there's some element of language that's already in the gestural system, but gesture is not language. So we've been trained to disregard gesture, that we look at language as having linguistic universals, but this provides evidence for the fact that gesture serves as the roots for certain types of distinctions that we see in language. So both signers and gesturers do have patterned differences when deciding to use handling or instrument strategies. You see a more marked increase, a more marked distinction in signers, but that difference is there even in hearing non-signers. Let me go on further. I was giving a talk at the University of Chicago where I was talking about tools pretty frequently in the talk, and someone in the audience asked about natural objects, natural things like fruits and vegetables or animals, and they asked what types of patterns you would see there. And I honestly had never thought of including those types of objects in our stimulus materials. What would happen if I showed participants pictures of fruits and vegetables? What would a hearing non-signer do in response to that versus someone who uses a new sign language or an established sign language? Would we see similar patterns or not? It turns out that we saw that they do use similar strategies. We created 30 images of tools, 30 images of fruits and vegetables, and 30 images of animals. We randomized the presentation of these 90 images and showed them to hearing undergraduate students at UCSD. I have to say I can't thank undergraduate institutions enough for having these gigantic pools of participants. It's like there's so many, it's just as easy as turning on water at your faucet. You know, I mean, who doesn't want to earn money to participate in an experiment when you're an undergrad? And there's so many people there who have never taken sign language, so you get these people that are just operating purely on guesses at how they would gesture something like a picture of an apple or a dog. And you see that some people are absolutely frozen in their tracks and they don't know what to do, but there's a good number of people that have fun with it, and they've never really had to try to communicate without using speech in the way that we're asking them to do in these experiments. So we would compare these undergraduate students with hearing non-signers from hearing deaf signers of CTSL, so people that used a new sign language. And then we compared them to those who used established sign languages, which were JSL and ASL in this study. So the gesturers are hearing Americans, non-signers. The CTSL results are deaf people who are using a new sign language. JSL and ASL are results from deaf people who use established sign languages. Each of the groups was exposed to 90 images. Let's take a look at the strategies that they used for tools. you see a nearly 100% evidence of patterns for the fact that no matter what category they were in, they would use the handling pattern for tools. For fruits and vegetables, they would use instrument patterns, and the same goes for animals. With fruits and vegetables, of course, if there's something like a banana, almost everyone made reference to peeling the banana. Sometimes if the people would make reference to how they prepare the fruits and vegetables, so there was some handling, but much, much less than what we saw when they referenced tools. In talking about animals, once in a while you would see people make reference to how they handle a horse, so how they would pull on the reins, but that was much, much less the case for when any of the people in these groups referenced animals. So how do you use an instrument to talk about animals? Again, the only type of handling that you might have is whether you're hitting the animal using reins, but that's not, neither of the handling or instrument strategies are ones that people often use when interacting with animals. What's important to note here is that there is a marked reduction in ASL in the use of handling or instrument strategies for fruits and vegetables, as opposed to when referring to tools. The same is true for JSL signers, that you see a dramatic decrease as compared to those who use CTSL or hearing gestures. Now let's look at what they do with animals when using a personification pattern. Overwhelmingly, everyone used their bodies when talking about animals. So if they talked about a cow, they made reference to horns on their head, so they personified the cow. If they referred to a giraffe, they would refer to their own neck. When referring to elephants, they started their gesture at their face. So they personified each of these animals and they used their own bodies. When they referred to, in ASL, the way that we refer to gorillas, we use our own body. But there was no use of personification when referring to tools. It's not like you tried to use your own head as the head of a hammer. I mean, you can do that if you want to be funny and if you want to do something like that on stage, but if you were really just using language, you would not use the personification strategy when referring to tools or fruits and vegetables. I mean, how do you be a banana? You might make reference to being unzipped or what have you, but what else can you do if you're trying to be a fruit or a vegetable? It just ends up being a comedic tool, not one for actual communication. We saw that this pattern was used almost exclusively for animals. In all, this tells us that there are very clear strategies for how we refer to tools, fruits and vegetables, versus animals. Some people did use the object strategy when referring to tools. For the most part, though, this pattern was used when referring to fruits and vegetables, and to a lesser degree when referring to animals. So, for example, most people made reference to cows by making a gesture to represent horns and putting them on their body versus out in neutral space. With fruits and vegetables, people often made reference to the shape of the fruit or the vegetable in a neutral space. From this analysis, we understood the difference to be that tools were man-made things and fruits and vegetables it's something from the natural world. We started to look at the research that has been done on comparing what's called man-made things versus natural kind. This quote is taken from a 1977 publication that was done on compounds in the English language. They found that if the thing being referred to was a man-made item, they saw one type of compound. If it was a natural item, they saw a different type of compound. For example, a snow goose is a type of animal. It was this term was usually used to refer to a goose that was white. But you were talking about the goose. In contrast to that, a pencil case is not a case that's the color of a pencil. It's a case for pencils. I'll give you another example. Is anyone in the audience British? Have any of you eaten a kidney pie? So this is a pie that is made of kidneys. But a kidney bean is not a bean made of kidneys. It's a bean that looks like a kidney. So English has different compounding patterns. This first type is adjective noun. The second is noun noun. Beth Levin did an analysis of compounds and said if you're talking about things like cakes or cookies, you'll talk about what it's made from, what its function is, but if you're describing fruits and vegetables, you'll describe what it looks like, what color it is, or where it comes from. The fruits and vegetables are of the natural kind, and the former group is of the man-made kind. So there's a distinction that we make in our language about things that have been made by people versus things that you did not make. I'll give you another example. If you look across different signed languages, what are different signs that you might have seen for tree? I've seen this before in China. It's a tracing strategy. This sign is an reflection of an object strategy. A reference to the branches might also be an object strategy. Has anyone seen a handling sign to make reference to a tree? I haven't. Have any of you? Do you see what I'm saying? What's another one? When we talk about natural things, when we talk about mountains, we use a tracing strategy. When we talk about trees or plants, I'm not showing what I do with those things. When I refer to a plant, I'm showing more of what it looks like. But when I talk about tools, things that I have made, I show what I do with that thing. Could you imagine me doing something like this to talk about a tree? If you saw me do this, your first guess might be that I'm shaking something, that I'm making reference to the size of something. I'm grabbing something cylindrical, so maybe holding someone by their neck. Maybe that I'm holding a pan and I'm panning for gold. Simply by using a handling strategy, it triggers the guess that you are using a tool. You will not necessarily think, not at first, that I'm making reference to a natural object like a tree. So this takes us back to that very first question. How is it that signers seem so readily able to understand each other even if you're using a different sign language? If you use a tracing strategy, then you already are inclined to think that you're talking about something natural, that you're not talking about a tool, a man-made tool. If I see reference to pointy ears, I know that you're talking about some kind of animal. I might not know what kind of animal, but I've already got some type of framework that I can use to base my guesses upon. If I see reins or a bit in your mouth, if that's the type of gesture that you're making, I might make the guess that you're talking about a camel or a horse, some type of animal that you ride. I wouldn't think that you're talking about a plate. When you see that signers and gesturers have these sorts of similar patterns, it means that they have guesses as to what you're talking about before you even know that language. I'm sure that these gesturers have never made reference, gestural reference to any of these 90 things that they saw, but when they were put in a position where they had to, they tended to choose the same strategy that we see in sign languages. Where does that come from? Is it innate? Some people argue that all humans act on the world in similar ways. We all drink, we all eat, we all prepare food, we all live in the same basic ways, and our gestures are thus influenced by these similar behaviors. Now, when you start a new sign language, you already have your roots behind that language. You already have something that you're bringing to the table. So you already are thinking, well, if I'm talking about something that I use, I'm going to use a handling or instrument strategy. If I'm talking about fruits and vegetables, I'm going to use something else, animals, something else. But it's not something that you are explicitly aware of. These are things, though, that you are bringing to the table when you develop language. You don't have to memorize these different types of signs. You just have to know the range of strategies, what types of strategies you would use, and then you're already halfway there. Language is structured, but its foundations already can be seen in what you're doing with gesture. And we have overwhelmingly, in our research studies, have looked at the structure that's given to language, but we haven't looked at the foundations of it. Does anyone have any questions? Is anyone not following what I'm laying out here? Okay, I'll move on then. We're getting close to the end of the talk. So we see that there's iconicity in gestures, there's iconicity in languages, so it persists from gesture to sign languages. Iconic patterning is found even in gesture. Where that comes from is a good question. But with sign language, this patterning becomes more amplified, more differentiated, more noticeable. They become useful in distinguishing nouns versus verbs, natural versus non-natural, artificial, man-made things. But one other point about animals that I thought was interesting. We usually use our body when making reference to mammals. When you talk about insects, you decreasingly use your body. So when you talk about a spider, there are a couple of ways of referring to it in ASL, but all of them are more disembodied. If you talk about reptiles, so snakes or lizards, those get signed more in a neutral space. You can imitate the look of a snake or how a lizard moves, but those are less about referring to it as a noun and more about trying to imitate how it moves. So we normally use our bodies when talking about mammals. So given all of this, I reflected on the fact that for a long time there's a couple of things that we've gotten wrong. In sign language research, our first mistake was that we looked too much at the hands and not enough at the body. Secondly, we have looked at modality as sort of this dichotomy that things are either spoken or signed. But people who use spoken language do gesture, and people who use sign do sometimes use speech. Humans are multimodal. It has been a mistake to focus on single modalities. If a hearing person was all of a sudden put into a situation where they had to live with deaf people, they would develop their manual intuitions about how to communicate using signs. If you need to communicate with someone with whom you don't share a language, you would figure out what to do. And what we've seen is that people would not be inclined to act like a tree, to not use their body as a tree, or to not use a handling gesture as a tree. When you think about performances by Bernard Bragg, what was that one he had, the woodsman? Come on, somebody here has got to know the name of that woodsman play that he does. Oh, the lumberjack, right? I don't know why that escaped me. He does the lumberjack, and he starts out by using a handling strategy. Then he uses an instrument. Then he becomes the tree. He personifies the tree. But if I were to talk to Bernard Bragg in person, I'd say, oh yeah, I went and saw that tree and I became the tree. It would look weird. Like all of a sudden I'm trying to perform this just, in everyday conversation. And again, it becomes more a tool for comedy than for actual communication. But how we shift through these strategies indicate that we are using things for beauty, for art, for performance, versus for day-to-day communication. So our claim is that iconicity is powerful and present at all levels in human language. We also see that there has been more investigation about iconicity in spoken languages. It's been under-identified. People are very inclined to think about sign languages as being very iconic, but there is evidence for iconicity in other languages throughout the world. For example, in many languages around the world, the word for mother generally starts with the M sound. The vast majority of languages have this pattern, even if they're totally unrelated to each other. Also, if you are talking about small things, the E sound is very present in any kind of diminutive reference, and then for anything large, there's often, overwhelmingly, a deep O sound. With that, I would like to close my talk, and I want to tell a story about the image that I use for my final slide. This is the picture of a family's home in Israel in the Bedouin community. I just love the image. I just thought it was so beautiful, and I used it at the end of some other talks. I thought the night sky was beautiful, the contrast of the colors of this home, which is a very typical Bedouin home. And not long ago, a husband and wife from this community came to the U.S., stayed at my house for 3 weeks. And a side note to that was really kind of disrupted that they came unannounced and wanted to stay with me for 3 whole weeks. I couldn't believe it, though. All of my furniture had also been rearranged because they positioned things such that it worked better for them. They moved my chairs, my sofa, because they don't use furniture in their homes, not generally. They just have light pieces of furniture that they can move around because they will bring a chair to a guest in their home. But here, we go to the furniture and sit in it. But the cultural practice in this community is that they bring furniture to you. If you're not comfortable in a given chair, then they move that chair and bring in a different one to you. So, I mean, it was disruptive scheduling wise, but also just literally they disrupted my furniture. Anyhow, they came to a talk. I pointed out the fact that before the talk, I told them I was going to use this picture. I said, it's so beautiful. I love the colors. I like to show this to people. They look at it and say, why are you showing people pictures of our underwear? That whole cluster of clothes right there is our underwear. And to me, this just emphasized two different cultural perceptions of the same picture. I think it's beautiful. I love the contrasting colors, and they look at it and just go, why would you show someone picture people's of underwear? So I think of this as an indication to the audience for any questions.
Thank you, Carol, very much. We now have about 30 minutes or so left, so if anyone would like to take advantage of that opportunity to come ask Carol some questions, I'd ask you to come line up here on stage left. There are also some markers up on the stage, and I'd ask you to address your question from that vantage point so that you will be appropriately on the video screens. And we're now open for questions from the audience. Fascinating conversation. I have some friends who are studying Native American Sign Languages and talking about the communities that they go into for research and the fact that their lives and lifestyles are quite different. I wonder if language and gesture are based on human experience, and if that's the case, have we looked at testing people about things they have not yet experienced, like people who've never seen snow, for example, seeing what they might gesture in that kind of example? Have you looked at that?
Yes. I'm looking to the tech guy. Can I give my answer? What's interesting about that, let me tell you a funny story. We have this other experiment that my students are working on. It's an experiment looking at two-handed signs. And they argue that two-handed signs tend to be used for whether plurals or anything that is large in size. So they went to this community in Turkey, the CTSL users, and showed them a picture of a house with snow in the yard. We showed this to a woman, and you should have seen this woman's face. She looked at it for a while and just signed, "It's a house." We said, "What else?" She literally couldn't even see the snow. She thought it was just a really bad picture of a house. They have snow there, but if you were to test people that live in remote places, they don't have much experience reading pictures. You have to live in a culture to understand images from that culture. So there were a lot of pictures that we showed her that she didn't understand in the ways that we had intended her to. So the way that we talk about snow is more by using that object strategy. You start with a reference to the color white. It's two-handed. Now, let me pose this same question to you. If I had to pick a tool that you had never seen before, what do you think, which type of strategy might you use? How would you gesture it, or how would you sign that thing? If I showed you a picture of a tool from another culture that you had never seen before, how would you sign that thing?
Well, I think most tools probably have commonalities like a handle. So I might look at it as how I'm going to use it and come up with a gesture that would describe that. Is that what you mean?
Well, you just sort of started to answer your own question, but let's see, this is sort of a test to see if you see what I was getting at in my talk. Which strategy would a hearing non-signer use if they came across a picture of a tool they had never seen or used before?
I wonder if it might be personification or acting it out in some way.
Okay. I wish I had like a strange looking tool that I could show you. Hold on one second. Great. What is this?
I think I'd describe it like this.
Okay, and what strategy was that? For folks in the audience, what was that he just did? He used tracing and object. Why did he not use handling or instrument? Because he doesn't know what it is. He doesn't know what the human action is that you use this thing for, so he had to use the object strategy. So that's your answer. Now go ahead and try and personify this thing. Would that be what you would do if you were actually trying to communicate with someone? Would you?
No, I wouldn't.
And you didn't. You traced it. So if I showed you a strange animal, then you might use personification. You might make reference to some feature like its ears, its horns, its legs, or something like that. So would you personify a strange-looking animal, or would you use tracing? If you were trying to describe a sloth, what would you do? All of this really is just to emphasize my point about what would you do, and your intuition about what to do is the same intuition that hearing non-signers would have. This shows us that there's already a sense that when humans know what to do with something, they use the same strategy. But where does that come from? Where did your intuition about using the tracing strategy come from?
I don't know. It's interesting. I saw it, and then that was my natural response.
Right, so you would look at this, and personification doesn't feel right. This thing is not alive. It's just a thing. It's a man-made thing. So when you don't know what to do, then you'll just use the object strategy. Once you know how to use it, then you would use the handling or instrument strategy. Thank you, Clifton.
Just making sure I'm on the right spot. So the people involved in your study were all adults, right?
Yes.
I'm wondering what might happen if it was a child and they picked potentially the wrong strategy. What might happen there? Did you notice that? Was that something that you identified? Do kids do it incorrectly? Do they act out?
I have not worked with kids. I know from experience I'm not very good at working with children. But Annie Senghas, who has done work on Nicaraguan Sign Language, took some of the stimuli that we had and showed them to 4-year-olds just for fun. And it was so shocking to see what 4-year-olds would do. They would do things like this for scissors.
Interesting.
They would do this for a hat, like a little tiny mini baseball hat. What else did they do? They did this for a toothbrush.
And were they hearing or deaf children?
Hearing, non-signing children. We could not believe it. A lot of work has been done on child language, some pretty good studies about how children use handling strategies. They termed it something different, but what they see is that children do not use handling so often. They use the instrument strategy more often, but they ran this on just 5 children. We did this with 100, so we had an N that would let us see a more clear trend, a clear strategy. But it would be interesting to look at how children use these strategies. I mean, certainly by the age that they were tested, they've used scissors, so they could have used the handling strategy, but they didn't. There was something else for book. Their sign for book was this. They would do this for book. They do really different things. I mean, for sure they had experience with books. They had experience with bears. You could, say to them, well, like, this bear's not going to understand you. And for a 4-year-old, it's hard for them to understand that. When they get into older childhood, they understand handling and they start to use that strategy more like adults. But we didn't test young children like in the ages of 3 to 6. So I'm very interested in your question, but I don't have an answer for it. I also think experience drives some of this, so a young child wouldn't know how to use a screwdriver, but the toothbrush example is also strange. I mean, if they brush their teeth every day, why would they not use a handling strategy? I don't have a theory about how children understand these things, but maybe that says it's not from birth, that it has to be learned. I mean, this is a whole different way of thinking about language.
Thank you.
Adam?
I am really excited to see this topic come up and see how much more depth has gone into it, and running down the rabbit hole is just amazing with this topic.
I feel the same way. That's a good way of putting it.
I'm wondering about the natural types of sign language that are established, like American Sign Language, BSL and the like, New Zealand, etc. And you said ASL and JSL were more instrument, but New Zealand Sign Language was more handling. So I think that's interesting. What kinds of things do you think might have affected those two different trajectories? Is there something related to their particular cultural experience, do you think, or what?
Okay, I really have to fly out to New Zealand. I want to go. Someone is collecting data there for me, and I'd like to go and retest subjects with video stimuli to see if they respond differently to videos. I've looked at those who use British Sign Language, but New Zealand Sign Language seems to use ASL and instrument strategies with sort of a 50-50 distribution. In ASL, you see a strong preference for instruments. I don't know. It seems like tools work in a different group. I mean, even with animals and fruits and vegetables, they didn't work in the same way. We asked if they had different ways to talk about apples, like just a plain noun versus a handling reference to an apple, if you wanted to make particular emphasis on how someone ate the apple. But they didn't. They just sort of would alternate between these two types for tools. And I honestly have been quite perplexed at trying to figure out what's going on with their sign language. One thing I would propose here, let me go back to something. If you take a look at what ABSL signers do, it's almost the exact opposite of what hearing people do. With ASL, it's different than what hearing people do, but it's not as strongly different as ABSL signers. We have other ways of distinguishing noun-verb pairs that have to do with the movement. We can fingerspell the names of nouns. With ABSL, the way that they sign hammer is like this. This is the instrument strategy. They're signed for lipstick. We use a handling strategy. They use an instrument strategy. This sign is ice cream. When we talk about ice cream, we use the handling strategy. They don't have noun-verb pairs, they don't have finger spelling, so it seems like this is the way in which they mark nouns. This is how they make the noun-verb contrast, is by using handling or instrument strategies. I didn't put the data from the JSL signers in this slide. The problem with this project is that I found something, but I didn't understand it. So I had this data, but it was just like, what the hell is that? Well, you don't have handling and instrument strategies in spoken language. So when you get this information, you try to figure out what it means. You sort of go on this like wild goose chase. And then now you have people that ask about kids. And what does that mean? What about fruits and vegetables? Like the thing I said about the person who asked me the question at University of Chicago. And I realized that fruits and vegetables are domesticated. So it would have been better to pick things like grass, rocks, trees, mountains, things that are very disconnected from people, things that are wild versus domestic things. I mean, in ASL, there are so many patterns. Initialized signs for royalty, kings, queens, princes, all of those have the same root movements. They're initialized, and it is all used for royalty. Then you have initialized signs that are used for many different branches of science. We don't see them because in the research because they are not present in spoken language. What we have done is focus overwhelmingly on the grammar, so things about WH questions or relative clauses. So we've taken what we know from spoken language grammar, seen whether it's present in ASL or other sign languages, and now that we've pretty much exhausted those options and we know that the same types of grammatical forms are present in language, now what else can we do? I think after, seeing this type of research, in 30, 40 years of the existence of a sign language that there are patterns that develop very quickly, and that is what enables people to understand each other right away. Thank you, Autumn.
Thank you. Okay, my comment might be a little related to your presentation and a little bit off track, but nonetheless, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, too.
So America is a melting pot of a multitude of cultures, of types of food, of experience, etc. So I'm wondering, is it okay for us in America, using American Sign Language, to borrow terms or signs from other places that we're not as familiar with? Like the sign for sushi. Can we borrow that sign? Or the sign for salmon. The sign that's used in the Northwest is this.
Oh, right. That's a reference to how they're caught. Which strategy, by the way, is that? When you make reference to the hook or being hooked, it's personification and the object. So your hand is showing the object, and then you are using your body for personification. You're showing the mouth of the fish. Sorry, back to your question.
So is it appropriate to take on those signs into our lexicon?
I think there's nothing wrong with borrowing, but I would guess that when you borrow, you would have to change it in some way so that it fits the language that you're borrowing it into. So, like your example with sushi, it's a reference to the fish laying on top of the rice. Let me give you another example from Vietnamese Sign Language. There's no finger spelling. Well, there may be an emergence of it, but back when I was more familiar with it, there wasn't finger spelling. There were many signs for fruits and vegetables, many more than we have in ASL. We have a sign for apple, orange, banana, peach, but not for like mango, kiwi, passion fruit. Well, right, okay, pumpkin, we have another one. But we use finger spelling as sort of our fallback. They didn't use that strategy in Vietnamese Sign Language. They had to innovate signs. What we saw is that they would use their left hand to reference the shape, and then their right hand to offer more information. So they did one thing for dragon fruit, and then several variations with different types of fruits, but all with the same base left hand. Then for different types of beans, you would have the same base left hand and use different actions on your right hand. We don't have that type of distinction in ASL. We have signs for things like onion, tomato. What other vegetables do we have? Beans. Some people do this. Oh,
bananas, potatoes.
Right, potato. That's an object strategy. But in general, our ability to refer to fruits and vegetables as with signs is fairly limited. When you talk about broccoli or asparagus, we just fingerspell it. But in Vietnam, you saw that they used a different strategy that was suitable for their sign language. So if we were to borrow from Vietnamese Sign Language, we would alter that sign so that it fits what we do. So if we don't use two-handed signs in the way that they do, then we would change it in a way that suits our rules. So I don't think there's anything wrong with borrowing in and of itself. I wish we had a better sign for asparagus. It'd be nice if we could look to other sign languages to see how they talk about asparagus. Why don't we do stuff like that more often?
I mean, I agree with you. I think there's no difference to when you look at English and the idea of shampoo, which is technically a French word. Khakis are from French. So I believe that ASL in no different a way than spoken languages can incorporate elements of other languages.
And that's true. Why don't we do more of that? I've seen the sign that you used for salmon once, but it's not common.
Yeah, or using remember that old car, the old Yoda? I remember that sign from quite some time ago.
Why do you think that ASL hasn't borrowed more?
I don't have an answer to that. I guess maybe when linguists get together, if they decide that it's okay to borrow, then they can set up the idea that, for example, we can take the sign for sushi.
It's an interesting question why we don't borrow more than we typically do. We just use fingerspelling, maybe because fingerspelling in itself has a pattern that if you fingerspell something, then you know that you fingerspell because it's an unusual fruit or an unusual vegetable. What's that one vegetable? Kohlrabi, right? I mean,
or okra.
Yeah, if you don't have a sign for it, then the fact that it's fingerspelled already gives a clue to the listener that it's an unusual fruit or vegetable.
Thank you.
Gio?
Thank you for a really entertaining lecture. As I looked at all this, I'm wondering a couple of things, and I'm wondering if you have noticed the same. When you throw a picture or something at a hearing person, they tend to be a little awkward at first and trying to stay in the box to decide what it is they're trying to do, and a little hesitant to get out with the gesture, and they try to attach themselves to something that they can use to anchor in the room. But if you look at young signers, how they do it, non-signers, that idea of staying inside the room and using something that they can see, like the guy who was sitting and doing the paint turned to paint on the other side of his body. I wonder, do you have any idea why hearing people tend to respond that way?
That's a great point. We all know that there's a difference between signing and gesture. And with signing, you already have an ease of referring to signs, to names of objects and verbs. It's not like you're just using things randomly. You're selecting from things. One of my colleagues, John Haviland, developed an idea of portability. He studied families, one family in particular that had 3 deaf boys. Everyone else in the family was hearing. So essentially these 3 boys are just one generation of signers, and then they ended up not marrying, not having children, so they remained the only generation of signers in their family. It was just a one-generation sign language. And he looked at them to see when signing becomes portable, that in itself becomes a measure of time. So take color, for example. With ABSL, a reference to your hair means black. Shaking your hand means blood, and it also means red. And doing sort of what might be considered like a puff of air towards neutral space is white. For every other color that you want to refer to, you have to point to something that's in your physical space. We have black, red, white, green, yellow, blue, orange. If there's something like peach or a very specific color that you want, then we would fingerspell the name of that color. But we only revert to fingerspelling when we sort of become stuck. His argument was that as a sign language matures, it becomes more portable. You don't have to look for colors in your environment. You just make standardized ways to reference it. With ABSL, they're borrowing a little bit from Israeli Sign Language, so you're seeing some change there. There's one color, I can never remember what color it is. I know the word is puce, but I never know what color that looks like. Is that in the green family? What color is puce? It's a greenish? It is? What kind of green?
It's an ugly green.
I don't know. I mean, like, I don't know. I mean, it's not like a vivid green. I don't know. Let's say that you want to be particular about green, then you would point to the shades of green in your environment, and the more detailed you want to be about the color that you reference, the harder you'll search for something in your environment. But Haviland says that it becomes a marker of age, that as you have a community that grows in size, you can bring your language, you can bring your signs with you to different places.
I think it's possible that I'm asking the last question because time's upon us. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very compelling. And I remember working with some of these elements in the lab and finding some of these differences with you, so that was a really great experience.
Right.
And Adam was there for part of that as well.
Right, when we all fell down that rabbit hole.
For a long time I've had this idea about gesturing and how it transposes itself over toward language, and is it because it becomes more meaning-based, and where's that dividing line? And I know that thought's been out there for a while. But I also remember looking at children learning math and the idea of giving gesture into that, and not necessarily with the sign language per se, but adding gesture to the teaching of math and pointing in the room and showing what's going on as a way of supporting the learning of math. And what we need, though, is for teachers to become more comfortable using those kinds of strategies. So if someone's learning sign language, like in the ASL classes I'm doing, I start off with some gesture. And, people seem to be a little hesitant about that until they can get to the stage that they're more competent signers. So I'm just wondering how we marry all of that.
Very good question. Very good question. This makes me think of the question that was just asked about children. I'm not sure what the data on children would look like. Similarly, I'm not sure what the data would look like for late learners who were not exposed to language growing up, like you said, who I have no idea what they might look like. But recently, one of our graduate students at UCSD, who also worked at Purdue, she looked at deaf children who lived in big cities but had not yet met other deaf people, so they were sort of mainstreamed by themselves in these public school classrooms, and she tested them, unfortunately not using these same pictures. I, again, would like to be able to go back and retest these children. She did another experiment with them, and the way that they signed things, they were essentially home signs, and we would try to figure out whether home signers had flexibility in how they refer to things. The problem with some who are home signers who've learned to sign late, they're not very adept at altering their communication to help the person that they're communicating with understand. They don't know how to adapt themselves to their listener. I think there's something about already having language that influences our gesture. How is it that having language, it helps hearing people gesture, and why is it that gesture helps hearing people think? I don't really know. It's an entirely new way of looking at language, but you're right. And the person who asked me about children, these are all the right questions to ask, and these are the types of things that you have to ask to understand this phenomena. So, very good questions, and I'm glad that people get what I'm trying to do.
Hi, Carol. Hope I'm standing in the right place. I did leave in the middle for a moment, but when you were talking about strategies, what that said to me was, I think that's a really important consideration.
Well, let me ask you, where do they come from? Where do you think those strategies come from?
Well, I think it's human. I think when we encounter something, we have some sort of natural way to choose a strategy, and maybe it's some of the features of what you're engaged with or the action that's about to happen. Talking about handling, perhaps that's part of the thought process, but maybe it's what helps people sort of get the big picture. So another layer of finesse in all of this is if we are looking at a tool, and you say we would naturally pick handling or instrument for that. So what I do with my hand is also how I might move with that object in my hand. So in America, there might be some things that we use that have some more utilitarian uses, unidirectional movement that's repeated. So you don't hammer vertically, for example, but you might paint in a vertical up and down shape, and that gets repeated while you're painting. So maybe those are some of the steps in how the usage happens that lead to the strategies we select.
It's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. One of the tools that we showed people was a mop. Americans pushed the mop, but Bedouins moved the mop side to side. Each culture has their own special way of recognizing movement. So when you use a handling strategy, you have to know what that movement is. When you see a paintbrush, you're not going to reference painting as if you were just painting the baseboards or something. You're going to paint a wall. Different cultures have different understandings of how to use these tools. But the question that I now have is, so for example, when you use a plane tool, it's a handling tool to surf it, to make something smoother, a smooth surface. My dad would use that in his wood shop. Could people sign that without ever having used it? I've seen it, so I know how it's moved, I know how it's used, I know how it moves. Even though I've never used a plane in my life, well, have I used it? I've used a sander, but I've never used a plane. But I could still talk about it, even though I've never used it. Men who may have never worn mascara could still make reference to women applying mascara. It's not like they're so inept at figuring out how to use the brush that they would make some reference that looks like they're poking themselves in the eyes. We pick the prototypical movements of an object based on the way it's used in that culture. So I think that really experience drives you to choose the right movement. This is what you saw the hearing people do when they were gesturing. But if you're talking about painting furniture, which you can paint, you would move your brush in different ways, but no one chose that type of painting. Almost everyone chose the type of painting that you would do when painting a wall. So that might be another layer of analysis. If it's bidirectional, unidirectional, that might be a phonological constraint. But I think the principle of what we choose and when is still there. And the same goes, I think that's one of the things about gesture that persists into language. And when you use a language, sometimes you don't see how these things are iconic anymore, but they are still there for the purposes of looking at a pattern.
Thanks.
Very good questions. Good discussion. Thank you so much. Very good.
I want to thank you again for this wonderful conversation that we've just been able to have. Much appreciation to you, Carol.